Welcome into Survivor Analytics. I am your host, Clyde, and today we're talking about who I would vote for in every final tribal council from Survivor's 30s. Last week, I discussed every season between Survivor Nicaragua and Survivor Worlds Apart, which you can find on this page. There's a lot of great seasons in this upcoming stretch, so let's jump right into it. Then we have one of the most strategically complex seasons in the history of the show in Survivor Second Chance, Jeremy versus Spencer versus Tasha. I'd vote for Jeremy here, but I think that Spencer puts up a really good fight. Spencer has moments where he outplays Jeremy in the post-merge, but Spencer's pre-merge is so much worse. He's well positioned for the Vetus vote in his first tribal council, but after that, the game flips against him, and he's on the bottom the rest of the way. His name is written down in 3 consecutive tribal councils. The post-merge is a different story for Spencer, as he's able to reintegrate back with the majority. He's the leader of the Steven vote at Final 9 that cuts one of Jeremy's closest allies. Then at Final 6, Spencer is the one who recognizes that Kimmy is flipping. Spencer probably plays the strongest post-merge game here, but I just can't pull myself to vote for him given the first third of the season. Tasha is kind of the flip version of Spencer, where her pre-merge is strong, but she fades into the background for the second half of the season. Early on, in the swap section of the game, Tasha is a key strategic player in convincing Abby Maria to flip over to her side to knock out PG and Varner. But then in the post-merge, Tasha loses a lot of agency. She's blindsided by the Kelly vote, blindsided again in the Steven vote, and once you hit the final 8, Tasha just attaches herself to Jeremy and follows his strategic ideas. She never considers flipping against him, which is a major misread on her end. This trio of Tasha, Jeremy, and Spencer all work together in the late game, but I feel that Tasha was the least influential in that group, so I wouldn't vote for her either. Then we get to Jeremy, who has the most consistent run on Cambodia of these finalists. He's in the majority for basically the entire season outside the Steven vote. Throughout Jeremy's game, he has consistent agency across his various voting blocks. He implements the meat shield strategy, preserving players like Savage and Joe to be taken out before himself. When Wentworth pulls off her famous idol play at Final 11, that minority alliance votes out Savage over Jeremy. I'd also give Jeremy a lot of credit for his connection to Tasha in the late game. Tasha knew that Jeremy was a threat. Jeremy had 2 flashy idol plays in front of the jury, but she still wanted to ride with him to the final tribal. Jeremy's game on Cambodia is very impressive. I think it's a fringe top 10 winning game, so he gets my vote. Next season is Survivor Kaoh Rong, Aubrey versus Ty versus Michelle. This was a very controversial outcome at the time of the season's airing. Most people thought that Aubrey deserved to win over Michelle, and I stand by that opinion. I think that Aubrey easily plays the best game of these 3. I've never been particularly high on Michelle's Kaoh Rong win. She spends most of the season on the bottom of her various alliances. She's not very well positioned for most of the pre-merge, and she lucks out in that her tribe wins every immunity challenge. Had Michelle attended a tribal council, she's in serious danger of going home. Then in the post-merge, she's initially in the majority, but she's blindsided by the Scott vote at Final 8, and from there, Michelle is completely powerless. She loses her closest allies in Julia and Jason, and by the time Michelle reaches the Final 5, she's the #1 target on the board. She relies on a Joe medevac and an immunity win to reach the final tribal. I'd also knock Michelle for her dependence on the juror removal advantage, where without that twist, Aubrey potentially wins the game. So of these finalists, I'd be the least inclined to vote for Michelle. I've grown on Ty's Kaoh Rong game over time. His pre-merge is solid. At the swap, he's a part of the move to convince the brains to flip on their own in knocking out Peter. But then in the early merge, Ty loses all control, and he has no clue what's going on for the votes against Nick and Debbie. At Final 8, Ty makes probably his worst strategic decision of the season in flipping against the pair of Scott and Jason. The 2 of them were hated by the Kaoh Rong jury. I bet Ty beats them in a final tribal, but Aubrey essentially guilts him out of going down that path. Not only does Ty turn down that duo, but he does it in a very aggressive way, where he refuses to pass Scott the super idol after promising him that idol earlier in the season. That move sours the jury against Ty and tanks his ability to win in most final tribal council combinations. The benefit of that Scott blindside is that it positions Ty back in the majority with Joe and Aubrey. That trio runs the rest of the post-merge with the intent of riding together to the final tribal, which likely would have happened if not for the Joe medevac. So reflecting on Ty's game at large, I think its biggest pro is its stability. Both Michelle and Aubrey have rounds of the game where they rely on medevacs to survive. Ty never depends on external factors to the same extent. The big con with Ty's Kaoh run, and the reason why I wouldn't vote for him, is the Aubrey factor. I always felt that Aubrey was more so the central strategic figure of the post-merge. She's the one pulling together this majority alliance for the Nick vote at Final 10. She leads the Debbie blindside in the following round. She convinces Ty to flip against Scott and Jason, which was against his best interest. Then towards the end of the season, Aubrey serves as the glue of that alliance with Joe and Ty. Aubrey's Kaoh game catapults her into an elite tier of Survivor players for me, but there's still some low points here that would cause me to hesitate with my jury vote. Aubrey is poorly positioned on the original Brains tribe, and she's nearly taken out at the merge, where she's basically saved by the Neil medevac. This is a case where the quality of Aubrey's post-merge is enough for me to look past those missteps, so she gets my vote. On to one of my personal favorite seasons of the show in Survivor Millennials vs. Gen X. It's Adam versus Hannah versus Ken. This is another instance where I would not vote for the season's winner. My jury vote would go to Hannah. I feel that Hannah had the most stable game of these three, and she loses the season largely due to the jury's misconceptions of her. When I compare Hannah and Adam's games, I feel that there are less tangible mistakes on Hannah's end. Adam has multiple rounds of just poor play. He's left out of the Mari vote in the first Millennial Tribal Council. In the early merge, he has the whole food smuggling situation with Taylor that makes him the target of the minority. At Final 5, he's blindsided by the Brett vote. Now, there are some impressive moves in Adam's run, like the Will Wall blindside, but those strategic plays still include Hannah. Hannah never experiences such drastic low points on the season. She's safely within the majority for most of her run. While Hannah's alliances feature Adam, I always felt that Hannah was positioned more towards the center of those groups. She's the glue of that four-person alliance that runs the late game, as we see her constantly talking Adam out of going after David. What's crazy is that Hannah is later ridiculed in the final tribal council for keeping David to the final four. I actually don't hate that decision. David was a massive threat to win the game, but he was a pretty poor challenge performer. He was the perfect person to cut at the end. Adam didn't perceive David the same way. He failed to gather the numbers against him for a large chunk of the post-merge. Had he succeeded in taking out David earlier in the game, Adam probably faces more adversity, as there wouldn't be this massive shield for him. For some reason, the jury of this season credits Adam for the David boot, even though he failed to pull off that plan on multiple occasions. Based on what I saw on the show, David was taken out only when Hannah lit the green light. I just believe that Hannah was the better socially insulated player with more strategic agency. I spent all that time comparing Hannah and Adam, but Ken is still here. I personally wouldn't consider voting for Ken. I think that he spends most of the season operating as a strategic follower, working behind David. The times when Ken steps up strategically, he makes some pretty bad decisions. At Final 9, he decides to test Will's loyalty, which almost causes Will to flip against him. Ken was the least influential player in this final tribal council, so his inclusion doesn't change my decision. I'm voting for Hannah. Next up, it's Season 34, Survivor Game Changers, Brad versus Sarah versus Troyzan. I'd vote for Sarah here, and it's not particularly close. Sarah plays one of the most dynamic games in the history of the show, one where she's bouncing between alliances in the post-merge without ever burning her relationships in the process. Looking strictly at this final three, Sarah straight up outplays the pair of Brad and Troyzan. In the mid-merge, she knocks out many of their allies like Debbie at the final 11, then Sierra at the final 9. Sierra was one of Brad's closest allies, so it's really impressive that Sarah was able to not only orchestrate that blindside, but also trick Sierra into willing her the legacy advantage. The only real knock against Sarah's run on Game Changers is the final 6 where she needs immunity. Technically, Suri had the numbers to take out Sarah in a 3-2-1 vote, but that was also a spot where Sarah's legacy advantage was expiring. Sarah decided to play that round a bit more aggressively, knowing that she was safe at Tribal Council regardless. I think that Sarah plays a fringe top 10 winning game of all time, so my jury vote is locked for her, but between Brad and Troyzan, I'd say that Brad has the better performance, especially in the pre-merge. Brad is a central strategic figure of his original tribe. His work in that joint tribal council is incredible, where we see him leading the charge against Malcolm and convincing Ty to play his idol on Sierra. The post-merge is a bit more turbulent for Brad. There's a couple rounds where he has no clue what's going on, but he reintegrates into the majority at Final 7, and he coasts to the final tribal from there. A lot of people remember Brad on Game Changers because he won 5 immunity challenges, so that's another thing to consider here. Then there's Troyzan, who didn't do much strategically on this season. He spends most of the game working behind Brad, who didn't have a lot of agency either. Troyzan never pulls off a move that separates himself from Brad, and by the final tribal, he knows that he's not winning. So like I said, I'm voting for Sarah here. That takes us to Survivor Triple H, Ben versus Chrissy versus Ryan. This was one of the tougher decisions for me, and it was a real toss-up between Chrissy and Ryan. I wouldn't vote for Ben in this final tribal. He has a strong pre-merge, one where he's calling shots from the majority, but he completely loses control in the back half. He's the consensus target every round starting at the final 7, and he relies on 3 straight idols and the introduction of the Force Fire-Making Challenge just to reach the final tribal council. Even in those rounds where Ben has immunity, I think that he plays suboptimally. His decision to use his idol before the vote at the final 6 removes that element of surprise, and it pushes the power back in the hands of the majority. What distinguishes Ben's win on Triple H from Mike's win on Worlds Apart for me is the fact that Ben never dismantles the majority from the bottom. He has a flashy idol play at Final 7 that takes out Lauren, but outside that move, he's operating with almost no strategic agency. That leaves Chrissy and Ryan. The two of them actually play very similar games in the post-merge. They're initially in the majority alliance between the Heroes and Hustlers, picking off the members of the Healers tribe. That alliance flips against them at the final 9 with the JP vote, and they're on the outside of the Joe Blind side at final 8. From there, Chrissy and Ryan locked down a final 3 with Devin that was primed to reach the final tribal council had it not been for Ben idling his way to the end. Now, I think that Ryan deserves slightly more credit than Chrissy for that late game stretch as he built a stronger relationship with Devin. So the post-merge is a point in favor of Ryan, but Chrissy has the much more solid pre-merge. In the swap section of the game, she pulls Ryan away from his number 1 ally in the Rourke vote. That move destroys one of Ryan's closest connections in the game, and it forces him to cut Ally in the following round. It's a clear example of Chrissy pulling one over on Ryan. In a final tribal council where 2 contestants have such similar post-merge resumes, I need to fall back on the pre-merge, which would lead me to vote for Chrissy. Next up, we have Survivor Ghost Island, Dom versus Laurel versus Wendell. Just like the real final tribal, this is just a battle between Dom and Wendell. I would not consider Laurel with my jury vote. She connects with Wendell and Dom in the swap section of the game, but her decisions within that group are pretty misguided. She constantly caves to their strategic interests, the biggest example being the final 8, where she passes up the opportunity to cut Wendell. Once the numbers dwindle to that core alliance, Laurel is outplayed by the other 2 guys, and she's essentially forced into taking out her ally Donathan at the final 5. So with Laurel out of the picture, it's between Dom and Wendell. I think that Wendell is the better holistic player here. I'd have more confidence in him winning any random season, but when you narrow the focus to just Ghost Island, I gotta say, I think that Dom plays the better game. I always perceived Dom as the player more out in front with that alliance. At the second swap, he's one of the players throwing the challenge to knock out Bradley. In the early merge, he leads the charge against his rival Chris Noble. Later on at the final 6, Dom bluffs with the fake idol in order to take out Seabass. On top of all that, Dom is generally safer throughout his run on Ghost Island. Wendell is nearly taken out at the final 8, and he potentially needs immunity at final 6 and final 5. In other words, Dom never had the opportunity to take the shot at Wendell in the late game, but the second that door opened, he throws Wendell into fire-making. Wendell had that chance to strike against Dom at final 6, and he doesn't do it. The main factor in favor of Wendell for me is his role in that Nvidia alliance. Wendell felt more like the glue of that group, the player keeping most of its members loyal, especially Laurel. It's no surprise that all of those allies voted for Wendell in the final tribal council because he took the time to build those relationships. So you can't go wrong with either option here, but I'd vote for Dom. Moving ahead to a modern classic, Survivor David versus Goliath, Angelina versus Mike versus Nick. This is a tight race between Nick and Mike, but I'd lean towards Mike for the consistency of his game. Nick has the highest peak of these finalists, which happens in the early merge where he's a pivotal strategic figure in flipping the game in the David's favor. He leads the legendary John Hennigan blindside at Final 12, taking him out through a minority vote split. It's one of the most impressive strategic moves from this era of the show. He follows that up with the Dan Tribal Council, knocking him out with the use of a vote steal. The issue with Nick's game is everything after that initial peak. He's out of the loop for the Carl blindside at Final 9. He then willingly gives up his allies from the David's tribe in Gabby and Christian, and by the time Nick reaches the Final 6, he is fully dependent on that alliance with Mike and Angelina. There's an argument that Nick is voted out without immunity in those last 3 rounds. Mike's game is kind of the inverse of Nick's in that he loses control in the early merge with the votes against John and Dan, but Mike recovers well from that position. He takes control at the Final 9 in convincing Gabby and Christian to flip against Carl, and from there, Mike runs the show with the Goliath majority. He cuts all of Nick's original allies from the David's tribe in 3 consecutive tribal councils, and while Mike needs to win force firemaking towards the end, he has such a huge influence over the game in the post-merge. That's enough to earn my jury vote. Angelina is also here, but she was never a real contender for me. Throughout the post-merge, Angelina is used as a scapegoat by her various alliances. Her name is offered up by the Goliaths at Final 13 and Final 12, which reveals some pretty poor positioning on her end. She later attempts to gain favor with the Davids by cutting Alec at Final 10, only for them to vote out Carl behind her back in the following round. Angelina bounces back at the Final 8 through that alliance with Mike and Nick, but she's the least instrumental member of that group. She's often following the strategic demands of her allies, and when Angelina tries to separate her game, she makes some very questionable moves. Her decision to plant a fake idol on Allison at Final 5 only serves to burn Allison's jury vote. So in the battle between Nick and Mike, I'd vote for Mike here. Then it's Survivor Edge of Extinction, Chris versus Gavin versus Julie. I'm not voting for Chris here. I think that Chris's win on EOE is the worst winning game in the history of the show. It's a game that's fully dependent on production-infused twists, as Chris is voted out in episode 3, and he relies on the introduction of the Edge of Extinction to earn a spot back in the game. Even after his return, Chris plays suboptimally. He's got one impressive move at the Final 6 where he convinces Lauren to play her idol on him, but he needs to use an idol on himself in the following round. That's not even an idol that Chris acquired in the game. It was handed to him by production as a reward for winning the Edge of Extinction challenge. The fact that Chris was voted out at all automatically disqualifies him from earning my jury vote, but his gameplay in that final stretch solidifies my decision. Between Gavin and Julie, this is an easy vote for Gavin. Julie's game on EOE is an absolute roller coaster. She's constantly falling in and out of the majority, and the times where Julie is in the know, it's more so due to the social work of her ally Ron. In other words, Julie's strategic peak on this season is a second-in-command role. Her low points in the post-merge generally overshadow those moments for me. She's left out of the votes against Eric, Wentworth, Wardog, and Ron. While she eventually navigates back into the majority, that's really only due to her reputation as an easy beat. She was the player who everyone wanted to ride with to the final tribal. That leaves us with Gavin, who doesn't dominate the game strategically by any means, but it's still the best performance on the board. Gavin is a player that's in the majority for most of the season, and he never faces any real individual adversity. His name is never written down in a tribal council. I feel that Gavin was always perceived as a valuable ally by a lot of the big players on the season like Victoria, and those relationships offer him a lot of safety, but also valuable information. Outside of the Wentworth vote, Gavin is a part of the consensus plan at every tribal council. Now, he's never really directing the ship. I don't think there's a single vote on EOE where you can point to Gavin as the leader, but it's an above average losing finalist game, so Gavin would earn my jury vote. Next up, Survivor Island of the Idols, Dean versus Nora versus Tommy. If you watch my winner ranking video, then you know I'm very high on Tommy's game. I think that it's one of the 10 best winning games in the history of the show. One where Tommy is constantly faced with these unlucky situations, and he overcomes them through his social gameplay. At the Split Tribal, Tommy is thrown into a horrible spot where he's outnumbered by the opposing Lyro players 4-1, and he still survives. Later on, Tommy loses a core ally in Dan through an ejection. Production definitely made the right choice in removing Dan from the show, but that was a massive blow to Tommy's strategic game. At that point in the season, he intended on rolling to the final 3 with Dan and Dean. With Dan gone, Tommy adjusts his strategy to ride with Dean and Nora instead. Many of the common issues that I hear with Tommy's game are factors facilitated by the Dan ejection. For example, Tommy probably struggles in a jury vote against Lauren, who lost in firemaking. The thing is, Tommy never intended on bringing Lauren that far into the game. She was pushed one spot closer to the final tribal when Dan went out. Beyond that, Tommy was just the central strategic force of the post-merge. His group takes control at the final 9, primarily due to Tommy's move in the Split Tribal, and from there, he runs the show with Lauren, but he's tactical in terms of the order of their eliminations. Tommy convinces Lauren to knock out many of her secondary allies, so that by the time they reach the endgame, almost everyone left is more loyal to Tommy than Lauren. It's an all-time win for me, but we can still hit on the other finalists here. Between Dean and Nora, I'd say that Dean plays the stronger game. He's on the outside of his original Lyro tribe and the swap Lyro tribe. He actually needs an idol played on him from Kelly Kim right before the merge. But then in the post-merge, Dean aligns with Tommy, and that's where his game starts to turn around. The issue with Dean is that he never pulls off a move over Tommy that makes up for his atrocious pre-merge. As for Nora, I wouldn't vote for her either. She's positioned towards the bottom of the Vokai tribe in the early game. She accidentally paints a target on Kelly's back in the jackboot, which causes Kelly to go out in the next round. From the final 12 onwards, Nora is included in the consensus plan, but she never has a lot of agency in those moves. I'll also note that Nora is a player who greatly benefited from the Dan ejection. Without that incident, Nora is likely voted out by that trio of Dan, Dean, and Tommy in the endgame. So this one wasn't really a question for me. I'll vote for Tommy. Then we have Survivor Winners at War. Michelle versus Natalie versus Tony. This is a Tony vote by a landslide. Tony plays one of the most impressive strategic games of all time here. In the early merge, he's working with Sarah in the majority, picking off many of the peripheral players. At the final 9, he has a wildly impressive move where he overcomes the extortion disadvantage and he takes out Sophie through a plurality vote. That play put Tony in the power seat and it limited Sarah's long-term options. From there, Tony runs the game with his main alliance. He overcomes massive obstacles like Natalie returning from the edge of extinction and immediately painting a target on his back. To be honest, Michelle and Natalie just aren't that close for me. Natalie is the first person voted out of the game, and she relies on the edge of extinction twist to return, which basically disqualifies her for me. Even beyond that, Natalie's play once back in the game is pretty bad. She tells Tony that she's going after him, she needs immunity at Final 6, and she only survives through an idol play. Then at Final 4, she wins individual immunity, and she doesn't put herself up against Tony in firemaking. I'm normally not the type of person to criticize firemaking decisions, but we need to remember that Natalie spent most of the game alongside the jury on the edge. She got a blueprint on how to win the season, and she just doesn't take the opportunity. Michelle has a stronger holistic game than Natalie, but it's still not great. Michelle spends most of the post-merge on the bottom, completely oblivious to what's going on. Off the bat, she loses a core ally in Wendell. She navigates back into the majority for a couple rounds, but starting at the final 8, Michelle is just out of the loop. She's blindsided in 3 consecutive votes against Kim, Jeremy, and Nick. Going into the final 5, Michelle was in a spot where she needed to win out, but her game is largely saved by Natalie returning from the edge. So I've said before on this page that I consider Tony the greatest player of all time. He's getting my jury vote here. 40 seasons down, 8 to go. Come back next week where I'll dive into every final tribal council from the new era of Survivor.